Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome dear learners. This video is for the subject of education and the course for which this is prepared is Bachelor's in Education. The paper which is covering this particular video is Child Development and Learning. The module or the topic is Behavioral Learning Theories, and this particular lecture is covering Pavlov's learning theory. The course coordinator for this video is Dr. Iram Khan from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. The subject matter expert is Professor Jasim Ahmed from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. And the academic expert or reviewer for this video is Professor Sara Begum from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. This particular video is produced under the project DTH Swayam Prabha channels of MHRD, New Delhi. So let us welcome Dr. Jasim Ahmed for this discussion.
Hello dear learners, I am Professor Jasim Ahmed from IAC Faculty of Education, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. And the topic of our discussion today is Pavlov's learning theory. During this lecture and discussion, we will try to discuss the experiment conducted by Pavlov and his learning theory. We will also discuss the meaning of conditioning and classical conditioning which he has given, and we will discuss the role of conditioning in behavior modification or learning by the children and by any human being. We will also discuss the implications of Pavlov theory of learning, and finally we will try to discuss and deliberate on the critique of Pavlov conditioning theory of learning. Dear friends, we have already discussed about behavioral approach of learning when we discussed on learning as a construction of knowledge in the previous lecture. But still, before we go into the discussion and deliberation on Pavlov's learning theory, it is better to put some light on behavioral learning. As we have already discussed, and you must be aware that behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behavior as opposed to internal events like thinking and emotions. So behavioral learning basically focuses on learning through modification of behavior, modification in our approach of interacting with one another, and through developing a bond between stimulus and response. So it is a kind of habit formation by the learners. There is no importance or place of reasoning, logic, thinking, cognition, and other mental process in the behavioral approach of learning because it focuses on the enduring modification of behavior, basically is the process of learning. It focuses on practice and exercise in the process of learning, and so the main focus of behavioral approach of learning is basically on putting learners onto the practice, putting learners onto the exercise and repetition and drill and this kind of activity. So only concerned with observable stimulus response behavior. That means behavioristic learning concerns with observable stimulus response behavior and states all behaviors are learned through SR bond, through forming association between the stimulus and response, and through interaction with the environment. Now we are moving towards Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, I.P. Pavlov, and his theory of learning. We must know something about Pavlov. Pavlov was basically a Russian psychologist, and he is popularly known for his theory of classical conditioning. Pavlov's principles of classical conditioning have been found to operate across a variety of behavior therapies and in experimental and clinical settings. Primarily, he was a scientist researching in the area of physiology of digestion, working of saliva, how saliva works, and the role of pancreas in the process of digestion. His interest in classical conditioning occurred almost by chance during one of his experiments on salivation in dogs. After that, Pavlov worked closely with animals throughout many of his experiments. His early contributions were primarily about animal learning. However, the fundamentals of classical conditioning have been examined across many different organisms, including humans, as per Tarpi in 1975. The basic underlying principles of Pavlov classical conditioning have extended to a variety of settings such as classroom and other learning environments. Now, try to understand what is basically classical conditioning, which is also known as Pavlovian or respondent conditioning. It refers to a learning procedure in which a biologically potent stimulus, for example, food, is paired with a previously neutral stimulus, for example, bell. It refers to the learning process that results from this pairing, through which the neutral stimulus comes to elicit a response, that is salivation, that is usually similar to the one elicited by the potent stimulus, which was food. Pavlov was conducting experiment on salivation in dog in response to being fed. That is, he was doing experiment in the field of physiology of digestion in dogs. And through this experiment, he was trying to infer the physiology of digestion in human being. He, during his experiment, he inserted a small test tube into the cheek of each dog to measure saliva. When dogs were fed with a powder made from meat, he predicted that the dog would salivate in response to the food placed in front of them. But he noticed that his dogs would begin to salivate as soon as they heard the footstep of his assistant who was bringing them the food. This observation, try to understand, this was basically the observation which developed the interest of Pavlov in behavior modification and learning. You can see in this diagram how this is basically the experimental setup of Pavlov. So this is totally total experimental setup. Pavlov is sitting on other side of the dog, and the dog is being put in a situation where he is being controlled indirectly, and the amount of saliva being secreted from his mouth is being measured. How much saliva is being secreted in what circumstances and in what situation. So now let's move towards some of the important, thing about this experiment. So Pavlov discovered that any object or event which the dogs learned to associate with food, such as the lab assistant footstep, would trigger the same response. He realized that he had made an important scientific discovery. Accordingly, he devoted the rest of his career to studying this type of learning. Classical conditioning occurs when a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Now, first of all, try to understand what is unconditioned stimulus and what is neutral stimulus. But for example, if we take something in our mouth, for example, if we take pickle in our mouth, or if we see pickle in front of us, automatically salivation starts in our mouth, and so our mouth becomes wet just to see the pickle or by taking something into our mouth which is eatable in nature. So this is basically unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. So whenever you see some tasteful thing in front of you, or you keep something into your mouth which is tasteful, which is eatable, then it releases saliva in our mouth. So this is basically unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. But for example, if you see a wax in front of you, and if you keep this a particular small piece of wax into your mouth, you will not going to salivate. So anybody will not be salivating just on looking at the wax, or putting a piece of wax into its mouth, or piece of wood into the mouth. So this is basically neutral stimulus, because this piece of wood or piece of wax or a small stone or a part of brick, these are the things on seeing which, or putting something some of these kinds into our mouth, it doesn't produce salivation in our mouth. So these stimulus are basically neutral stimulus because these are not going to produce saliva in our mouth. Now, what Pavlov did in conditioning, we will be discussing just a moment later. And so, if this pairing, pairing of unconditional stimulus with some neutral stimulus is basically the theme of this classical conditioning experiments. So if this pairing is repeated, yani if you pair some unconditional stimulus with some neutral stimulus for a repeated number of times, so then a time comes when the neutral stimulus acquires the response of unconditioned stimulus. And so in that situation, that neutral stimulus becomes conditioned stimulus, and the response produced by this conditioned stimulus is known as conditioned response. So let us try to understand, if this pairing is repeated several times for several days, a time comes when the neutral stimulus acquires the responses of the unconditioned or natural stimulus. The whole process is called conditioning. After conditioning is established, the neutral stimulus is now called as a conditioned stimulus, and unconditioned response becomes a conditioned, response. Let us try to understand the technical terms. Pavlov in 1902 started from the idea that there are some things that a dog does not need to learn, and so is the case with human being. For example, we don't learn to salivate whenever we see food. We don't learn to salivate whenever we see food because it is a biological instinct. It is a kind of reflex. The reflex of salivation is hardwired into us as a biological instinct. In behaviorist terms, food is an unconditioned or natural stimulus, and salivation is an unconditioned or natural response. In other words, the stimulus-response connection that required no learning. Instead, it is inbuilt or inborn instinct. So let us see here the different stages of Pavlov experiment. As you can see on the slide that in a stage 1, Pavlov has shown here that food is the unconditioned stimulus for dog, and when the food is presented to the dog salivate. So saliva is secreted. So this saliva is basically unconditioned response for the unconditioned stimulus, that is food. So this is a kind of reflex, and for this no learning is required. Every human being, all of us have this kind of salivation. Whenever we eat some food, saliva is there. Whenever we take bread in our mouth, we take a slice in our mouth, we take some favorite things in our mouth. When we take some eatables which are our favorite, which we like and which taste to us, when we keep or when we see these things, salivation is produced, saliva is produced. So this is a kind of reflex action, and this is a kind of a biological instinct, and for which no learning is required. It is biological in nature. So try to understand, unconditioned stimulus produce unconditioned response. That is, the natural stimulus produce natural response. This was basically the main frame of the experiment of Pavlov. Now, stage 2, you can say here that this is neutral stimulus. N is for neutral stimulus. For example, metronome. Another example may be bell, maybe a stone, maybe wood, maybe chalk. Anything which is not eatable for dog or for all of us. Anything which cannot produce saliva in our mouth. So the neutral stimulus, there is no response at all. So this is another thing. Now what Pavlov done at third stage is that he combined stage 1 and stage 2 together. So he gave dog food, and at the same time bell was rung at the same time, and there was a response of salivation. So here in stage 3, unconditioned stimulus, that is food, and neutral stimulus, that is bell, was put together, placed at the same time, and the result was seen that unconditioned response was there. And this unconditioned response, that is the saliva secretion, must be because of the first stage, that is because of the presence of food. But here you can see that food and bell are put together. they are being placed at the same time, and saliva secretion is being observed. And this was repeated many a times for many a days. And after some time, what did what was done by Pavlov, which was quite surprising, that at fourth stage, Pavlov eliminate food at random, and only bell was rung as a neutral stimulus, and even then it was observed that salivation was there. And so just on ringing of bell, saliva secretion was observed. And this was basically the completion of the conditioning, because the dog learned to produce saliva just on the presence of bell. At this stage, when bell, the neutral stimulus, acquires the response of a unconditioned stimulus, that is natural stimulus, that is salivation, then it becomes a conditioned stimulus. Now the name change, nomenclature changes. Now the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response. And this whole process is basically the process of conditioning. And when we use this approach in the teaching and learning of our students in the classroom and the school setup, in the home setup, when we try to make our children, make our students learn something by combining the unlearned things with something which is already learned in the past, when we club together and with the help of that we try to create some kind of learning, then it becomes a Pavlovian conditioning learning approach being used in the process of teaching and learning. The dog in this experiment had learned an association between the bell and the food, and a new behavior had been learned. Because this response was learned or conditioned, it is called as conditioned response, also known as Pavlovian response. The natural stimulus has now become conditioned stimulus, as I already said. Now, in this experiment, Pavlov also gave a law which is called law of temporal contiguity. Pavlov found that for association to be made, that is the association between the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus, that is bell and the food. So Pavlov found that for association to be made, the two stimuli had to be presented close together in time. If the time between the conditioned stimulus, that is bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, that is food, is too great, then learning will not occur. This theory is called classical conditioning because it is the first systematic study of basic laws of learning or conditioning. The second reason may be that the conditioning or learning is being done with the help of association of conditioned stimulus with some classical behavior or reflex, that is unconditioned stimulus. So friends, now try to understand the key elements or processes or principles of classical conditioning. First of all, try to discuss acquisition. Acquisition is the process of acquiring the natural or unconditioned response by a neutral stimulus, that is NS. In other words, the process of achieving conditioning, that is the bond between conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, is basically the process of acquisition. The speed of conditioning depends on a number of factors, such as the nature and the strength of both the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Similarly, other factors may be the previous experiences and the animal's motivational state also play a very important role in acquisition of some new learning. Second one is extinction. If the conditioned stimulus is presented without the unconditioned stimulus, and this process is repeated often enough, the CS will eventually stop eliciting a conditioned response. Means, as we have discussed, that the clubbing of unconditioned stimulus or food with bell resulted into the salivation, the production of saliva. So the dog learned to salivate just on the presence of bell. But if this relationship, conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, are put for a long time, then a time will come when the dog forget to salivate just on the placement of, on the position of, on the presence of bell only. So this process of forgetting, or this process of elicitation of stimulus conditioned response relationship is called extinction. At this point, the conditioned response is said to be extinguished. Means that the relationship or the bond which was formed between neutral stimulus and unconditioned response is now broken down. It is vanished. It is finished, and this process is called extinction. Now the question is how this extinction may be rejuvenate or maybe renewed. So this is another key concept in this process, which is called reacquisition. If the conditioned stimulus is again paired with the unconditioned stimulus, a conditioned response is again acquired. But this second acquisition usually happens much faster than the first one. Next important element is a spontaneous recovery. Maybe after extinction, you as a teacher or a master of an animal to whom you are training, you may be forgetting to try for the renewal of the extinct behavior, extinguished behavior. But the organism automatically some time later on, after a gap of time, the organism automatically respond and show the previous bond which was formed. That is conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So this is called a spontaneous recovery. So a spontaneous recovery is defined as the reappearance of a previously extinguished conditioned response after rest period. That is, if the CS is, that is conditioned stimulus, is tested at a later time, for example, an hour or a day or 15 days after extinction, it will again elicit a conditioned response. This renewed conditioned response is usually much weaker than the conditioned response observed prior to extinction. Now, the next important element is renewal. Renewal is a re-emergence of a conditioned response following extinction when an animal is returned to the environment in which the conditioned response was acquired. And it means to say that maybe the teacher or maybe the master or the trainer is not trying to do anything, but simply because of putting the learner or putting the organism in a particular environment, the environment elicits that particular response, which was in a condition a little ago or a few days ago. And this is so the renewal is being automatically revived, automatically being done by the organism on their own. Now we come to the next key element, and this is a stimulus generalization. A stimulus generalization is said to occur if after a particular conditioned stimulus has come to elicit a conditioned response. A similar test stimulus is found to elicit the same conditioned response. Usually, the more similar the test stimulus is to the conditioned stimulus, the stronger the CR will be to the test stimulus. Conversely, the more the test stimulus differs from the CS, the weaker the CR will be, or the more it will differ from that previously observed. It means that stimulus generalization is basically when there is a affinity, when there is a similarity in the variety of environment, in the variety of stimulus. So whatever bond has been formed between a stimulus and response, and if the same kind of stimulus is provided to the organism or provided to the learner, it is found that the same sort of response is given by the learner. So here we can see that the stimulus is generalized by the learner. This is basically the concept of stimulus generalization. Now come to the next key element, stimulus discrimination. One observes a stimulus discrimination when one stimulus, that is maybe CS1, elicits one CR, that is conditioned response, and another stimulus, say the CS2, elicits another conditioned response or no response at all. This can be brought about by, for example, pairing CS1 with an effective US and presenting CS2 with no CS. So this is basically the stimulus discrimination, the key element in the process of Pavlovian conditioning. The next element is stimulus substitution theory. According to Pavlov, conditioning does not involve the acquisition of any new behavior, but rather the tendency to respond to old ways to new stimuli. Thus, Pavlov theorized that the conditioned stimulus merely substitute for the unconditioned stimulus in evoking the reflex response. This explanation is called the stimulus substitution theory of conditioning. Now, friends, come to the discussion on educational implications of classical conditioning theory. We will try to see how this theory, that is Pavlovian conditioning, can be implemented, can be applied in our classroom situation, and in what way we as a teacher can use this in our classroom teaching learning process. Fear, for example, fear, love, and hatred towards one or more subjects are created through conditioning. So if you are a good teacher, if you love your students, if you appreciate your students, if you are social to your class students, if you have good rapport and good relationship with your students, so this particular relationship, your behavior help in developing interest in your subject by those students who are weak in that particular subject, or those who don't like that subject, but because of your attitude, because of your behavior, because of your relationship with the students now develop a good taste of your subject. So this is basically because of the classical conditioning. If a science, for example, if a science teacher is not competent and skilled in using the effective methods of science teaching, may be disliked by some of his or her students. If the teacher's behavior is also not satisfactory to students, they may develop fear and hatred towards science in due course of time. So both ways this is possible. You can develop interest, you can develop positive attitude, you can develop interest towards your subject by putting yourself as a good teacher in front of your students, by putting yourself as a good example for your students, by helping your students, by having good relation with your students, by having good ethics with your students. You can attract those learners towards your subject, and in course of time they can develop their interest in your subject. And contrary to this, if the teacher is not good in his ethics, if the teacher is not having good relation with the students in the classroom, then maybe that many of the students may in course of time develop hate and hatred towards that particular subject for which the teacher is showing or reflecting that sort of negative behavior to the classrooms. Teachers' sympathetic attitude, interesting, joyful, and effective method of teaching may develop desirability and positive attitude toward the subject through the process of conditioning. Use of audio-visual aids in teaching learning process involves the conditioning theory as well, in making students learn through association. For example, when we teach a child A for apple, and at the same time we show the child either real apple or picture of an apple with the word written below the picture. So in the entire process of getting the child learn A for apple, basically the process of conditioning is being used. The child learns the meaning of apple through conditioning process. Conditioning may help in developing desirable habits, interest, attitude, sense of appreciation in the children as well. For example, if a child is not interested in homework, parents and teachers may try to develop positive attitude towards doing homework by associating it with some of his or her likes, such as watching some channel. Maybe the students are or the children are interested to watch some of their channel in which they are interested, and they are not interested in doing homework. So the parents can can discuss with the child that if you will complete your homework, then I will hand over this remote of the television to you, and you can see whatever channel you want to see. So in the first instance, the child will try to finish the homework so that they can grab the remote of the television and can change the channel which is going on in the home and watch their interested channel. So whatever they like to see, and in course of time they will develop the habit of doing homework on their own. So by using this kind of strategy, you can make children learn some habit or develop some skills which they were not interested in previously. Again, unhealthy attitudes, superstition, fear, and phobias may also be removed through deconditioning. For example, if a child is having fear from any subject or any object, he or she may be made to seek pleasure from it. I can share with you my personal experience during the monitoring of Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. I have been associated with the monitoring of Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan in the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, and also Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan in the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh in due course of time for almost 8-9 years. In one of my visit, I was visiting some districts in Bihar, and for 1 week I was there in particular district. One day I was going to visit schools in a remote area of the district, and I was having with me block extension education officer who was deported with me to be there with me for the entire week. So in my vehicle I was there, block education officer was there, and the driver was driving the vehicle. When we left that town area and we were moving onto the road in remote areas, at a sudden I saw that a cat crossed the road, and as soon as the cat crossed the road, the driver also saw that, and driver started to slow down the vehicle. But I sensed the mind and the brain and the feeling of the driver, and he could not stop because of some reason that I was there, block education officer was there, but he slowed down the vehicle and was basically fearing to cross that mark from where the cat has crossed. But sensing the situation, I just called the driver and ordered him to stop the vehicle. And when he stopped the vehicle, I got down alone and crossed that particular mark alone. And from that side, I gave the signal to the driver to come now. And so the driver took the vehicle to the mark I was standing. Then I again ride on the vehicle, and I travel across that particular block, saw different schools, and in the evening at around 5:30 p.m. when I reached my hotel where I was staying, then I talked to the driver. You are okay? I am also okay, and the block education officer is also okay. We all are okay. So this is nothing else. I mean to say that if this type of situation again comes in front of that driver and that block education officer, I'm sure that he's not going to stop now. So if this kind of situation arises in front of you and this kind of example is there, then because of conditioning and some superstition also removed from the mind and heart of all of us. So conditioning also help in removing the barriers and the superstition and the fear and phobias of different kinds from our minds. Now, friends, let's talk about the critique of behavioral theory of learning in general, and Pavlovian conditioning in particular. As we have discussed that behavioral theory of learning focused on behavior modification, and so it is supposed to be totally a mechanical approach of learning where the strengths are, where the learners are put to drill, put to exercise a lot, put to practice a lot, and because of those practice, because of the drill, because of the exercise, ultimately they develop that kind of skill, and they learn through memorization or through cramming. And in the entire process you can see that the use of reasoning, use of intelligence, use of mind, use of thinking, imaginations are not involved. So it is a kind of animal learning. Humans should not be treated as machine or animals. This is the most important critique of behavioral learning theory approach. Human intelligence, cognitive abilities like reasoning, thinking, logic, and imagination, these are the skills which are not given proper place or consideration in behavioral approach of learning as well as in Pavlovian conditioning theory. Now, at last, friends, we can say that in the entire discussion of deliberation in this particular lecture, we have covered behavioral approach of learning, where we have found that basically the modification of behavior is learning. So, for any learning, there is some change of behavior, and the change of behavior is basically enduring in nature. Pavlov's classical conditioning also find that there is a behavior modification, and in the behavior modification, basically it is a formation of SR bond, that is a stimulus response bond mechanism. A kind of association is being developed here between the stimulus and response, and so the formation of this bond, this stimulus and response bond, is the basically process of learning in Pavlovian conditioning approach. And we have also discussed how we can develop good habits, how we can develop interest among the students toward different subjects and toward different topics, toward different issues of the society, issues of the community, towards different functions of the family and the community at large. So through conditioning, we can develop positive attitude among the learners, and at the same time, by using deconditioning, we can eliminate fear and phobias and negative attitude from the personality of the learners. So the major concepts under classical conditioning, that is acquisition, extinction, exponents recovery, and all other major concepts we have already covered in the discussion and deliberation. We have also discussed the educational implication that we as teacher can use the Pavlovian conditioning theory in our classroom, because many things are basically learned through conditioning. Many things are learned through cramming by students. For example, the value of pi, that is 22/7 or 3.14, basically at the school level, when the students are studying in class 6 or class 7th or class 8th, they are not taught why the value of pi is 22/7. They are not taught. They are supposed to cram. Similarly, when we talk about mnemonic devices in teaching learning process, the pedagogue teachers, the methodology experts used to teach this in their teaching learning aids, that there is some aid like mnemonic aids, those aids which help in memorizing some facts. For example, we used to tell our students to cram board-mass rule in mathematics. So board-mass rule, learning of board-mass rule, basically it is a cramming. So students have crammed the board-mass rule, and this cramming is basically functioning throughout their academic career. Similarly, we cram, we learn a lot of things through basically conditioning process, and at the same time, our teachers, our parents help us to remove our negative attitudes and negative behavior or fears and phobia by using different type of conditioning. So critique of the classical conditioning and behavioral approach of learning are a lot, but it cannot be said that classical conditioning or behavioral learning is totally totally useless. No. So we should understand, and personally I feel that as a teacher I must try to understand the behavioral learning theory as well as the constructivist theory approach, and wherever we find that this particular theory, that is behavioral, is more working, we should apply behavioral learning theory, and where we find that constructivist theory is more working, we should apply constructive theory of teaching and learning. And when both of these are you can apply, then of course you should apply constructivistic approach of teaching and learning, so that your students can develop a deeper understanding of the subject you are trying to teach. So friends, with this I thank you all, and wish you to see you in the next presentation. And these are the references which have been consulted in preparation of this entire presentation. Thank you so much.
You were watching the module number 22nd of this particular course, which was based on behavioral learning theories. This was the first lecture, which was on Pavlov's learning theory. This video lecture was recorded by faculty at home during the national lockdown period for COVID-19 pandemic using minimal technical resources. Technical errors, if any, are unintentional and may please be ignored. For any queries with regard to this lecture or broadcast, kindly send your email to techsupport@dth.ac.in.